The Supreme Court plans to hear cases on two of President Trump's immigration policies. The first involves funding for the southern border wall. The second, whether individuals seeking asylum have to wait in Mexico until their cases are heard. NBC News Justice correspondent Pete Williams joining me now from Washington. Pete, let's start with that wall funding case. A federal appeals court ruled back in June that the administration improperly diverted $2.5 billion of the Pentagon's counter-drug program money to build more than 100 miles of the border wall. Tell us more about the arguments that we expect the Supreme Court will hear in this case. What are the challenges here?
You know, in both of these immigration cases, they are now sort of academic because the work on most of them has largely stopped. But you're right, the money case is a very simple question. The opponents say Congress, only Congress, can reprogram this money. The president has no authority to use the money out of this Pentagon budget. The administration says, oh, yes, we do. We can use it for military emergencies, and that's what this is. Now, the lower courts have said that the money can't be spent. The Supreme Court has put those rulings on hold a couple of times. And the major issue may never be decided because in the past, the Supreme Court has basically said the groups challenging this use of the money, the Sierra Club, some communities that live near the southern border that are concerned about the environmental effects of the wall. The Supreme Court has suggested that they don't have the legal standing to challenge a congressional appropriation. So if the Supreme Court does get to the big question of whether the president can actually spend this money out of the Defense Department, it, as I say, is largely academic because most of the money has already been spent. Most of the border wall has been done, and the work for this program. And of course, if President Trump isn't reelected, it's unlikely to continue. But it is an interesting question about the president's authority to basically overrule what Congress has wanted to do with the money. Remember, this was after the big government shutdown. The president demanded lots of money for the wall. The Congress gave him just a little bit. So he has sought to get the money from other programs, including the Pentagon budget.
Pete, how about the other case? In this one, the Trump administration's appealing a ruling. It blocked the government from sending asylum seekers to Mexico while they were waiting for their court hearings. Tell us more about that one.
Right. This is what the government calls the Migrant Protection Program and what other groups call the Remain in Mexico program. It basically says if you're coming from one of these Central American countries through Mexico to get to the U.S., you have to wait in Mexico until you get your immigration hearing. And the government's justification for this is they say that many people who are allowed to stay in the country until their hearings are scheduled never show up for the hearings. They just sort of disappear into the country. And even when they do show up, they seldom get asylum. The courts seldom give the immigration courts seldom give them asylum. And the government says this program has been very effective at reducing the number of people trying to get across the border illegally. Now, the opponents of the program say two things. Number one, it violates a treaty obligation. And secondly, they say the places where these folks have been sent, some 60,000 of them, have been very dangerous. There have been sexual assaults. There have been all kinds of attacks. And it's just terrible conditions. But the fact is, it's really not in effect right now because the pandemic has virtually shut down this sort of immigration at the border. So this program is, again, somewhat academic. And I'm assuming that unless if President Trump wins the election, it may come back. If he doesn't, the Biden administration, I would think, would stop it.
Pete, I got one last question for you on a completely unrelated issue. It involves deer hunting. I understand the court's liberal and conservative justices agreeing on a case involving deer hunting in Vermont. Tell us about this one.
So in Vermont, they call it deer jacking. If you try to hunt a deer at night, that's illegal. And the case involves some game wardens who suspected that a Vermont man had done just that very thing. They did not have a search warrant. They did not get permission to enter his land, but they did so anyway. They kind of wandered around on his considerable property and eventually went to his garage, peeked in the window and saw what they thought was deer hair on the tailgate of his truck. So armed with that knowledge, they went back and they got a search warrant. But he challenged the conviction, and the Supreme Court of Vermont upheld the conviction, saying, no, police officers have the right to see what's in plain view. This is known as the plain view doctrine, that even if a law enforcement officer doesn't have a search warrant, he or she doesn't have to ignore what they can see with their own eyes. Well, Justice Neil Gorsuch, joined by two of the court's liberals, Elena Kagan and Sotomayor, sort of schooled Vermont today on this. Now, the Supreme Court did not take the case, but the three justices said, look, Vermont Supreme Court, you got this all wrong. Yes, it's true that there is a plain view doctrine, but that assumes that the law enforcement officer is standing somewhere where he or she is legally entitled to be. And you can't enter a person's home or the land around it, what the lawyers call the curtilage, unless you have a search warrant or some emergency or you've been invited. And they said the game wardens in Vermont didn't have any of that. So they said they hope that this will be an unusual miss by this court, and they understand why their colleagues didn't take it. You know, it's just another example that the Supreme Court is not the court of error correction. The Supreme Court, you know, gets tens of almost 10,000 requests to hear cases a year. It probably will hear argument or decide otherwise about 80 of those cases. And the main reason the Supreme Court will take a case is if there's a division among the lower courts. This is an example of the court not taking a case, even though I'm sure most of the justices, if not all of them, think that the Vermont case court got it wrong.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.